Folsom exposed the real story behind California's most violent prison. A place where even the walls seem to breathe fear. The camera fades in on razor wire glittering under the California sun. A slow zoom reveals the heavy stone walls of Folsom State Prison, one of America's oldest and most feared correctional institutions. They say every cell in Folsom holds a story, but some are darker than others. Inside these gray walls, men fought, bled, and broke under pressure. This is not the Hollywood version. This is the real story behind California's most violent prison. The sound of a steel door slamming echoes. A guard yells, "Lock down," followed by chaos, shouting, running, and the sharp clang of batons on metal. Narrator continues. Folsom isn't just a prison, it's a battlefield trapped in time. Built in 1880, it was meant to be a symbol of control. Instead, it became a symbol of survival. The camera pans across the old stone corridors, graffiti scratched into walls, names, numbers, and words like "never forget." Before the cameras, before the famous concerts, before the headlines, Folsom was a nightmare that never slept. And those who entered its gates knew one truth: once you're in, you might never leave the same. Cue low, haunting music. Fade into the title. Folsom exposed the real story behind California's most violent prison. Built for order, became a kingdom of chaos. When Folsom State Prison opened in 1880, California was trying to control a wave of crime spreading through gold rush towns. The prison was supposed to bring law and order. Instead, it created something else, a world ruled by power, fear, and survival. At first, it looked like a fortress from the Middle Ages, stone walls, iron gates, and armed guards standing like soldiers. The inmates were mostly hardened criminals, bank robbers, killers, and gang members long before gangs had names. But here's what people didn't know: the system inside Folsom was broken from the very start. Guards were outnumbered. Food was rotten. Cells were so cold at night that inmates used wet towels to block the freezing wind that slipped through the cracks. If hell had an address, one former prisoner said, it would have been Folsom. By the early 1900s, the place was already known for brutal punishments. Inmates worked long hours breaking rocks, building roads, and repairing machinery with no protection. If someone disobeyed, they were chained, starved, or locked in the hole, a tiny dark cell where days felt like years. The rules were simple: obey or disappear. But even under that kind of fear, the men inside began to fight back. Secret alliances were formed. Messages were carved into walls using spoons and nails. They built hidden communication systems through the plumbing, tapping out codes to warn others about guards or lockdowns. The guards called it discipline. The inmates called it war. The riots that shook the walls. By the 1940s and 50s, Folsom had a reputation across the entire state. Even other prisoners feared being sent there. Violence became part of daily life. Fights broke out in the yard over the smallest things. A look, a word, a rumor. But the worst came in 1970, when racial tensions inside exploded. California's prison population had doubled, and Folsom was packed beyond capacity. Old rivalries between groups turned deadly. On one summer morning, a simple argument in the dining hall turned into a full-blown riot. Metal trays became weapons. Homemade blades, sharpened from bed frames and scrap metal, flashed under the fluorescent lights. Guards fired warning shots from the tower, but the chaos didn't stop. Smoke filled the air from burning mattresses. By the time the yard went silent, 2 men were dead and dozens were injured. The media called it a prison gone mad. But those inside said it wasn't madness, it was survival. After that, Folsom became one of the most heavily guarded prisons in America. Towers were reinforced, the walls doubled with new wire, and the inmate rules became stricter than ever. Yet even then, nothing could stop what was coming next: the rise of organized power behind bars. You can lock up a man, the narrator says, but you can't lock up an idea. And inside Folsom, that idea was control. Fade out as the camera follows a line of inmates marching under the harsh California sun, the words, "Obey or bleed," scratched faintly on the wall beside them. The code of control. Inside Folsom, by the late 1970s and 80s, something powerful was forming, not just violence, but structure. The inmates began building their own system of rules, one that often worked better than the guards' orders. They called it the Code. The Code wasn't written down anywhere, but everyone knew it. It meant respect, silence, and loyalty. If you borrowed something, you returned it. If you started trouble, you finished it. And if you talked to the guards, you were done, sometimes literally. The gangs that would later dominate California's prison world, like the Aryan Brotherhood, Nuestra Familia, and the Black Guerrilla Family, all had deep roots in Folsom. It was here that they learned to organize. Each group had its own hierarchy, its own enforcers, and even its own form of justice. Some ran protection rackets. Others controlled the flow of contraband, cigarettes, drugs, even information. Inmates who broke the code weren't just punished by guards, they faced judgment from their own. In Folsom, respect isn't given, it's earned, one lifer said. And once you lose it, you don't get a second chance. Even some correctional officers quietly admitted that without the inmate structure, the place would have collapsed completely. The gangs, in their own twisted way, kept a certain order, brutal, but effective. Still, beneath the surface, tension was always boiling. One small spark, a debt, a rumor, or a power shift, could turn the yard into a war zone within minutes. The guards had to adapt. They learned inmate slang. They tracked coded messages hidden in letters and tattoo designs. And yet, no matter how many lockdowns they ordered, the real power often stayed behind bars, whispered through steel and concrete. As the narrator speaks, the camera shows tattooed hands playing cards in silence, eyes scanning every move, while a guard walks by pretending not to notice. In most places, guards run the prison, the narrator says. In Folsom, sometimes the prison runs itself. Fade out to the echoing sound of a gate slamming shut. The tension is thick. The line between survival and control has never been thinner. When the world looked inside, for almost a century, Folsom was a mystery to the outside world. People had heard stories, the riots, the escapes, the killings, but no one really saw what life inside was like. That all changed in January 1968, when a man in black stepped through the gates carrying a guitar and a message. His name was Johnny Cash. At the time, Cash was already famous, but his life wasn't perfect. He'd battled addiction, trouble with the law, and a restless spirit. When he decided to perform inside Folsom Prison, it wasn't for fame. He said he wanted to sing to men who the world had forgotten. When he walked into the dining hall, packed with hundreds of inmates, the room went silent. Then, with one strum of his guitar, he said, "Hello, I'm Johnny Cash." The room exploded. He sang songs about pain, regret, and freedom, things every man in that room understood too well. Folsom Prison Blues became an anthem, not just for prisoners, but for everyone who felt trapped by life itself. I hear the train a-comin', it's rollin', round the bend. For a brief moment, the walls of Folsom didn't feel like a cage. They felt like a stage, and the men inside felt human again. That concert became legendary. It showed the world a different side of prisoners, not monsters, but men who had made mistakes and were paying for them. But behind the applause, nothing really changed. After the concert ended, the gates clanged shut once again. The laughter faded, and the men went back to their cells. Yet, something inside Folsom had shifted forever. The prison wasn't just a secret anymore. It was a symbol of punishment, pain, and the possibility of redemption. News cameras began showing interest. Reporters wanted to see the real Folsom. But what they found wasn't music, it was misery. The 1970s and 80s brought overcrowding, new gang wars, and endless lockdowns. Cells built for one man now held 2 or 3. Fights became daily routine. Hope was replaced by survival instinct. Johnny Cash's song might have given Folsom fame, but inside those walls, fame didn't stop the blood. The music stopped, the narrator says softly. But the noise never did. The sound of a faint guitar fades into the background, then is drowned out by the clanging of cell doors. The modern fortress. By the early 2000s, Folsom had survived riots, killings, and over a century of chaos. But the world outside was changing fast, and so was the prison system. California was facing one of the worst overcrowding crises in U.S. history. Thousands of men were being sent to prisons that were already full. Folsom, once built to hold less than 2,000 inmates, now held more than double that number. The old stone walls were still standing, but inside, everything was evolving. New surveillance cameras watched every corner. Infrared sensors, motion detectors, and digital gates replaced the rusting iron ones. Guards no longer relied on instincts alone. They now had screens and radios tracking every movement. But one thing didn't change: the violence. Even with technology, Folsom remained one of the toughest prisons in California. Gangs still ran the yards, controlling drugs, phones, and loyalty. The Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, and Norteños all had their own territories. Every lunch line, every weight bench, every corner of the yard was claimed. A single mistake, walking into the wrong group space, wearing the wrong color, saying the wrong word, could cost a man his life. Folsom isn't just about doing time, one former inmate said. It's about doing it alive. The California Department of Corrections tried to separate high-risk inmates, create safer yards, and install more cameras. But violence doesn't die with steel and technology, it just hides until the right moment. Even officers were not safe. In 2002, a correctional officer was attacked in the line of duty, sparking another lockdown that lasted weeks. During those days, the men inside stayed in their cells 23 hours a day, 1 hour for shower or yard, alone. Some prisoners used that isolation to reflect, read, or write. Others fell deeper into rage and hopelessness. Folsom had become two prisons at once. One side, quiet, digital, controlled. The other, loud, angry, alive with underground power. You can add cameras, the narrator says, but you can't record a man's soul. Even in the 2010s, when rehabilitation programs grew, music, art, education, the ghosts of Folsom's past never really left. Some of the same hallways where men once rioted were now classrooms. Yet, if you listen closely, guards say, you can still hear echoes, footsteps, whispers, maybe even the faint sound of a guitar somewhere deep in the night. Folsom today stands as both a warning and a lesson. It's no longer the wild inferno it once was, but its story still burns beneath the surface. The camera pans over the aging stone walls, the razor wire glinting under the sunset. A guard closes the gate. The sound echoes. From the outside, it looks like a relic, the narrator says. But for those who've been inside, Folsom never really lets go. The music fades, deep, reflective, almost mournful. The screen cuts to black. Voices from the cells. Beneath the roar of Folsom's history are the voices that never make the headlines, the men who lived it. For them, Folsom wasn't just a prison, it was a test of who they really were when the world stopped listening. One of them was Marcus "Slim" Jefferson, a quiet man from Oakland. Convicted at 19, he arrived at Folsom in 1998, young, angry, and convinced he'd never see freedom again. First night, he recalled later, you don't sleep. The noise don't let you. You hear locks clickin', men shoutin', someone cryin', someone logan like they lost their mind. That's when it hits you, you're really here. Slim spent his first few years fighting to survive. He joined a group for protection, followed the code, and learned how to read people's eyes, because one wrong look could mean trouble. But after years inside, something changed. He found an old typewriter in the library and started writing. Letters, poems, even short stories. His words spread through the yard like wildfire. In a place where power usually came from fear, Slim found his through words. He started helping other inmates write letters to their families or appeals to the court. Some men who hadn't spoken to anyone in years began to trust him. You learn that freedom isn't always outside, he said. Sometimes it's just finding peace where no one expects it. Then there was Raul Mendoza, a lifer who'd been at Folsom since the late 80s. Raul had seen it all. The riots, the lockdowns, the gangs, the blood. But by the 2000s he had become what the men called an OG, an old guard of the yard who tried to keep the young ones from throwing their lives away. Back in my day, Raul said with a tired smile, We fought over colors. Now they fight over pride. Nothing's changed, just the excuse. He helped start a small mentorship group in the chapel, teaching new arrivals how to survive without violence. Keep your head down, he'd say, and keep your word. Some listened. Most didn't. But to Raoul, even saving one life meant something. And then there was Officer Daniels, a correctional officer who had worked the night shift for over 20 years. He wasn't the kind of guard who barked orders. He believed in seeing the men as human beings. He once said, "You can't guard people you don't understand. If you treat everyone like monsters, don't be surprised when they act like one." He'd seen inmates change, and others lose themselves completely. For him, Folsom wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about balance, keeping peace in a place built for chaos. These stories, Slim's redemption, Raoul's wisdom, Danielle's perspective, show that even in the darkest corners of Folsom, humanity still flickers. "Every man in here is living two lives," Slim wrote in one of his essays. "The one that put him here, and the one he's still trying to become." The camera fades to black and white photos of old cell blocks, hand-drawn tattoos, and worn notebooks filled with poetry. Behind every bar, the narrator says, there's a story, not of crime, but of consequence. Not of monsters, but of men. The music slows, soft piano under a distant echo of a train whistle. And somewhere in the silence of Folsom, the narrator concludes, you can still hear them, the voices from the inside. The secrets beneath the stone. Most people think they know Folsom, the riots, the gangs, the Johnny Cash concert. But what the public never sees are the secrets buried deep inside those walls. Because Folsom isn't just old, it's ancient by prison standards, and like any place built on pain and time, it keeps its ghosts close. Beneath the main yard, under layers of stone and concrete, lies a forgotten maze of tunnels and storage chambers. They were originally built in the 1800s to move supplies, weapons, and even bodies without being seen by the inmates. Over time, parts of those tunnels collapsed or were sealed off, but old-timers still whisper about what's down there. Some say the tunnels connect the prison to the nearby American River, used secretly to smuggle goods in and out during the early 1900s. Others say they were used to hide guards during riots, a silent evacuation route if the yard turned deadly. And then there's the rumor that makes even officers uneasy, that one section of those tunnels was used to punish men in total silence. No light, no air, no time. A place where the screams never reached the surface. The California Department of Corrections denies that story, but several former inmates swear they've heard strange sounds through the floors at night, echoing taps, footsteps, voices that don't belong. "You sit in your cell, it's quiet," said one former inmate known only as Tank. Then, out of nowhere, you hear knocking under your bed. 3 knocks. Every night. Same time. Like someone calling from below. Some guards say it's just the pipes shifting. But others, they don't make eye contact when asked. Beyond the tunnels, Folsom's archives hold files that never reach the public eye, records of unsolved incidents, mysterious inmate deaths listed as accidents, and guards who vanished mid-shift in the early 1900s. One document from 1912 mentions a missing tool cart found days later in a locked corridor, the same corridor no one had keys to anymore. Even the prison chapel has its mysteries. Built from the same gray granite as the main wall, the stained glass hides strange markings, initials, symbols, dates carved by the men who built it. No one knows what they mean. Some believe they were messages, others say curses. Places like Folsom remember everything, the narrator says, voice low. Even the things we'd rather forget. Today, parts of the old prison are open for tours. Visitors walk through the historic cells, the yard, and even past the execution chamber, but there are doors marked restricted. Doors that haven't been opened in decades. And behind those doors, it said, the real story of Folsom still lives, untouched, unspoken, and very much alive. The camera pans down a dim hallway, ending at a locked iron gate. A faint whisper echoes, then silence. Some secrets, the narrator says, aren't meant to be found. They're meant to remind us that in Folsom, the past never truly sleeps. Rebuilding the broken. Folsom today isn't the same beast it once was, but its scars are still visible. The stone walls that once echoed with screams now echo with lectures, prayers, and even laughter. But make no mistake, the soul of Folsom hasn't softened. It's just learned how to survive in a new age. Inside, a quiet transformation is happening. The California Department of Corrections has shifted focus, from pure punishment to rehabilitation. For the first time in its long, violent history, Folsom is trying to rebuild the men it once broke. There are now classrooms where the whole once was. Men study for their GEDs, take college classes, and even learn trades like electrical work, plumbing, or coding. There are self-help programs, anger management, substance abuse recovery, and group sessions where men are taught to speak about trauma instead of hiding it behind fists. One inmate, Darius King, has spent 17 years behind those walls. He says the change feels strange but necessary. Back in the day, you couldn't show weakness here, Darius says, his voice calm but firm. You kept your head down, you survived. Now, they're telling us to open up, to talk. At first I thought it was a trick. Then I realized maybe it's freedom. Freedom, in a place like Folsom, doesn't always mean walking out the gate. Sometimes it means finally forgiving yourself. Even some correctional officers have changed their perspective. They're being trained in de-escalation, learning how to calm situations before they turn violent. They talk more, shout less. There's an unspoken effort now to replace fear with understanding. Still, it's not easy. Every day, men who've spent half their lives in darkness are trying to adapt to light. Some succeed. Others relapse into anger, addiction, or despair. But then, there are the stories that prove change is possible. One man, Anthony "Tone" Morales, once known for leading a violent prison gang, now runs a mentorship group called From Chains to Change. He helps younger inmates learn that being hard doesn't mean being hopeless. I used to think Folsom owned me, Tone says, standing in the same yard where he once fought for his life. But now I know, it taught me how to own myself. Outside the walls, a small number of former Folsom inmates have formed organizations to help others re-enter society. They teach job skills, connect ex-prisoners with employers, and speak in schools about life behind bars. If my pain can stop someone else from ending up here, says former inmate Marcus "Slim" Jefferson, now a published poet, then maybe Folsom wasn't my end. Maybe it was my beginning. The old Folsom still exists, the violence, the ghosts, the fear, but now it shares space with hope. A fragile hope built by men who once destroyed, and now build. The camera pans across the yard as men walk quietly under the fading sun. The same walls that once trapped them now serve as reminders of what they've survived. Folsom can still break a man, the narrator says softly. But now, it can also rebuild him, piece by piece, word by word, until what's left is something human again. The music swells, slow, emotional, but uplifting. A black screen fades in with the words. Change doesn't erase the past. It teaches us how to live with it. The legacy that lives on. More than 140 years after its first gates slammed shut, Folsom Prison still stands, gray, cold, and unshaken. But beyond the walls and razor wire, Folsom has become something bigger than a prison. It's a symbol, a reflection of everything America fears and hopes about justice. When people hear the word Folsom, they picture danger, toughness, survival. But those who've been there, who've walked those yards and smelled the steel, say the truth runs deeper. Folsom is America, says Officer Daniels, now retired. You see everything here: power, poverty, hate, redemption, race, love. You see the best and worst of people. You see how far we can fall and how far we can climb back. The town around the prison has grown too. New houses, schools, and coffee shops surround what was once an isolated fortress. Tourists visit, taking photos by the massive granite walls, unaware that just beyond them, men are still living the reality those walls were built for. Every visitor feels something, that cold, heavy energy that hangs in the air. It's history. It's pain. But it's also proof that humanity can endure almost anything. Over the years, documentaries, songs, and interviews have tried to capture what Folsom is. But those who've lived it know you can't summarize Folsom in headlines. You can only feel it, in the echoes of the yard, in the silence after lights out, in the way the wind hits the walls and carries the memories of every man who's ever stood behind them. You don't leave Folsom, says Marcus Jefferson, the former inmate turned writer. You carry it, in your eyes, in your dreams, in your silence. And that's what makes Folsom different. It's not just California's most violent prison. It's a mirror, one that shows the truth about punishment, mercy, and the thin line between them. The narrator's tone softens, reflective. We built Folsom to lock men away. But in the end, it showed us something we didn't expect, that every wall we build to contain others also reflects us. The camera pans over the prison one last time, the stone towers casting long shadows over the yard. The sound of a train whistle echoes faintly in the distance, a quiet nod to Johnny Cash's song that made the prison famous. Slowly, the image fades into black and white. Then, the words appear on screen. History doesn't fade. It hardens, just like the stone of Folsom. Soft music plays, calm, haunting, and final. This isn't the end of Folsom's story, the narrator concludes. It's a reminder that even behind the hardest walls, the human spirit never stops fighting to be free. Where the truth can't be locked away. The screen fades to black, and for a moment, all we hear is silence. Behind every locked door, behind every number, every scar, every whispered prayer, lies a truth. A truth that power can't erase, walls can't contain, and time can't forget. The image fades back in, a slow aerial shot of Folsom Prison, surrounded by mist at dawn. The sun breaks through the clouds, lighting up the gray stone walls that have stood for over a century. Folsom isn't just a prison. It's a story of control, chaos, and change. Of men who were lost, and some who found themselves when they had nothing left to lose. The camera cuts to black and white portraits, real faces, nameless but powerful. In each one, you see pain, regret, survival, and sometimes redemption. We tell these stories because the system isn't just bars and uniforms. It's people. People who made choices, people who paid prices, people still searching for light in the darkest place imaginable. The tone shifts, more emotional, human. And maybe that's the real story of Folsom. Not the violence, not the riots, not the legends, but the reminder that every man has a moment where he asks himself, "Who am I now?" A slow zoom into the front gate, the same gate that's seen over a century of men come and go. Then, the sound of a faint train whistle in the distance. For some, Folsom is the end. For others, it's the beginning of a different kind of freedom, the kind that lives inside. The screen fades to black. If this story moved you, share it. Tell someone what you learned today. And if you believe that every voice deserves to be heard, even the ones behind bars, hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe. Because here on Voices from the Inside, we tell the stories the walls tried to silence.